Let's jump right in, because it is honestly hard to overstate just how drastically the fight for LGBTQ rights has evolved. Today, in this explainer, we're going to trace nearly a century of incredibly complex history. We're moving from the quiet, frankly dangerous shadows of early organizing right into the global spotlight of modern civil rights. So let's break down exactly how generations of people strategized, protested, and fought tooth and nail for basic human dignity. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll be walking chronologically through 6 key phases: before the Stonewall Uprising, Stonewall and gay liberation, the AIDS crisis activism, the fight for legal equality, transgender and intersex rights, and finally, the ongoing global struggle. All right, let's start with part 1, before the Stonewall Uprising and the early homophile movement. Now, when most people think of LGBTQ rights, their minds automatically jump to 1969. But resistance actually began decades earlier. Astonishingly, the Society for Human Rights was founded way back in 1924. Just think about that. And by the 50s and 60s, groups like the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis were already organizing to challenge psychiatric stigma. We even saw early street protests, like the Julius Bar Sippin and the Compton's Cafeteria Uprising in '66, plus the Black Cat Tavern protests in Los Angeles in '67. The groundwork for liberation absolutely did not happen overnight. It is absolutely crucial to understand the immense, life-altering risks these early organizers faced. During the Cold War, a federal policy known as the Lavender Scare actively hunted down and purged suspected homosexuals from government employment. I mean, imagine that. When the government itself is systematically targeting your livelihood, every single act of organizing, every meeting, is a massive risk. So because of that intense, suffocating pressure, early strategies, what we call the homophile movement, relied heavily on careful public protest, assimilation, community education, and publications like One Magazine, which, by the way, had to fight all the way to the Supreme Court just to use the postal service. But soon, this quieter approach would give way to gay liberation, and that was a completely different ballgame. Confrontational, highly visible, radical street resistance, and national pride marches. Which brings us to Section 2, Stonewall and gay liberation, igniting a national movement. That massive shift in strategy literally exploded in June 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Now, Stonewall wasn't the very first act of resistance, but it was absolutely the catalyst. What began as a routine police raid in June sparked several days of intense, furious resistance. It transformed localized anger over constant policing into a massive, organized national movement. It led straight to the creation of the Gay Liberation Front and birthed the annual pride marches we see across the country today. And, this new era of visibility wasn't just political, it was deeply cultural. Activists turned to art and symbolism for community survival and political demand. They embraced the rainbow flag, the art of drag, and perhaps most powerfully, they reclaimed the pink triangle. That was a badge once used for persecution in Nazi concentration camps, but they completely repurposed it into a fierce, highly visible symbol of LGBTQ identity and pride. Moving into the 80s, we hit Section 3, the AIDS crisis activism, focusing on public health and direct action. Silence equals death. This stark, incredibly urgent slogan became the definitive rallying cry of the 1980s and 90s. Facing a devastating epidemic, mass death, and just utter political indifference, activists quickly realized that when the government refuses to act, staying quiet literally means dying. Groups like ACT UP took to the streets, and they came with very specific life-saving demands. They forced faster drug approval processes from the FDA, they demanded better access to medical treatment, honest and clear public health information, and an absolute end to discrimination against those with HIV and AIDS. They were fighting for their lives, and in doing so, they completely revolutionized how public health advocacy works. A real game changer. All right, let's look at Section 4, the fight for legal equality, shifting to the courtrooms. As the movement matured, a massive new front opened up, and this time, it was in the legal system. The crucial concept here is the legal ripple effect. Back in 1986, a Supreme Court case called Bowers v. Hardwick actually upheld discriminatory state sodomy laws, completely denying constitutional privacy protections. But fast forward to 2003, and Lawrence v. Texas struck those exact laws down nationwide, directly overturning Bowers. Getting rid of that discriminatory precedent was the master key that unlocked the civil rights victories that were about to come. And we can actually trace that step-by-step judicial pathway really clearly. Step 1, Romer v. Evans rejected state efforts to block LGBTQ protections. That momentum carried into Step 2, United States v. Windsor, which weakened the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. And finally, that culminated in Step 3, the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges decision, establishing nationwide marriage equality. This was not an overnight win, folks. It was a decades-long, carefully orchestrated legal chess match. But hey, legal equality went far beyond just marriage. The landmark 2020 ruling in Bostock v. Clayton County was a massive economic victory. It ensured that millions of Americans could no longer be legally fired simply for who they are. The court held that federal employment discrimination law fundamentally protects workers from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Next up is Section 5, Transgender, Intersex, and Two-Spirit Rights, core to the movement. It is so important to remember that transgender and gender non-conforming people have been central to this movement since day one. We're talking about foundational early leaders like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Christine Jorgensen fighting right on the front lines. Today, that modern battleground focuses heavily on securing accurate identity documents, healthcare access, and inclusion in schools, sports, and housing. Meanwhile, intersex advocates are fighting hard for bodily autonomy, specifically ending unnecessary surgeries on children. And Two-Spirit resources are powerfully highlighting traditional indigenous understandings of fluid gender and sexuality. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, an ongoing global struggle, human rights worldwide. When we zoom out to look at the whole picture, we see that progress remains deeply, deeply uneven across the globe. On one side, we have expanding protections. Some nations have embraced dignity, rolling out legal gender recognition, marriage equality, and anti-discrimination frameworks promoted by groups like the UN and ILGA World. But on the flip side, the reality elsewhere is incredibly stark. We're talking continuing criminalization, state-sponsored homophobia, the criminalization of same-sex intimacy, and terrible violence targeting gender identity remain harsh realities for millions. It's a pressing, ongoing international human rights crisis. So, as we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a critical question. With major legal victories achieved but profound global and local challenges remaining, has the fight for equality truly ended? When researchers track the ongoing conflicts over healthcare access, religious exemptions, and transgender rights legislation worldwide, the data points to one clear conclusion. This incredible century of organizing isn't just a history lesson. It is a complex, evolving struggle that is actively being written today. What role will you play in its next chapter?